Grafitti. Written by Steam Art. Read by TARDIS9. Spencer glided into Knapford Station and stopped with hardly any effort. "You've done it again, old chap," said his driver. "Vickerstown to Knapford in half an hour." Spencer beamed with pride. "Did you hear that?" he asked Stanley, who had come to shunt away his coaches. "A smash record, though I say so myself. I bet even Gordon couldn't top that." The driver and fireman had arranged with the yard master to have Spencer spend the night at the shunting yards, since there were no free berths at the sheds. But Spencer was in such a good mood that not even this piece of news could dampen his spirits. "Perhaps it's for the best," he said to himself as he backed into a convenient siding. "That way, anyone working late can see me in all my glory." Idly, he watched the sun sink below the furthermost buildings before falling asleep. Soon after, the lamps came on, flooding the yard with a harsh white light. The silence was suddenly broken by the crunch of ballast. 4 figures were picking their way across the rails in sleepers. All were wearing hooded sweatshirts and jeans. One was carrying a duffel bag, and, judging by his awkward stumbling, it was rather heavy. And all 4 were making a beeline for the oblivious Spencer. At last they reached him, and congregated at the sight of Spencer that was shrouded in darkness. The one carrying the bag dumped it on the ground, causing a clanking noise from inside. "Shh!" hissed one of the other figures. "You'll wake him up." "Sorry," said the bag bearer, "but that thing weighs a ton." "That's why you're carrying it, Dave," said another figure. The first speaker, who seemed to be the leader, looked up at Spencer's bulk. "So what do you think, guys?" "Very nice," said Dave at last. "Very sleek and modern, I'll give you that. But why him, Len? Why not another engine like Paxton or Toby?" "It's that silver paint," said Len. "Does your eyes, doesn't it? So why don't we spice it up?" He bent down, unzipped the bag, and pulled out an aerosol can. "There's plenty for all of us. Let's give him a bit more color." "Aren't you forgetting something?" said a third figure, who seemed, by the sound of the voice, to be female. "His owners are the Duke and Duchess of Boxford. They'll skin us alive." "We'll be doing them a service, Jill," said Len. "We'll save them the trouble of repainting Spencer themselves." "Besides," said the fourth figure, "if you think about it, we'll be teaching Spencer a lesson. Remember how he tried to get heroes scrapped? And don't forget how often he's laughed at the other engines." "Couldn't agree more, Roy," said Len happily. He looked sourly at Dave. "And you wanted to paint Toby." "Well, come on. Let's get started." The 4 of them grabbed a can from the bag and set to work. No 2 of them had the same ideas on what to paint. They simply scrawled whatever was on their mind, and they scrawled it as large as they saw fit. They worked steadily, making sure to keep to the shadows and listening out for any other movement. Half an hour later, they stood back to admire their handiwork. "Good job, guys," said Len. "Now, I don't know about you, but I think we ought to get going before anyone comes." He and the others carefully replaced their paint cans in the bag. "So who are we doing next?" asked Dave, zipping the bag shut and scooping it up. "How about Diesel?" said Jill as they hurried away. "Oh, he's a nasty piece of work and no mistake." "I think we should do Thomas," said Roy. "I still say we should paint Toby," said Dave sulkily. "Diesel, Thomas, Stanley, Paxton, Emily, Harold." "Harold? He's not even an engine, you twit." "Well, why not?" Arguing all the way, the 4 vandals disappeared into the night. Spencer slept on. Before he knew it, he was awakened by a cry of alarm. Reluctantly, he opened his eyes to see his driver and fireman standing to one side, staring at him in shock. "What's the matter?" he demanded. "Look at this!" gasped the driver. "What's happened to your paint?" "Nothing's happened. Now kindly—" Spencer stopped. He had just caught sight of his reflection in the windows of the goods shed. What he saw made him let off steam in horror. "Bust my buffers! What's happened to me? Who could have done this? This is terrible! I'm a mess!" It took a while to calm Spencer down, by which time the entirety of Knapford and Tidmouth heard what had happened. The Duke and Duchess were of course informed, and they were every bit as upset as their engine. The other engines took great delight in teasing Spencer about his new look, but gradually a dreadful prospect began to dawn on them. "Spencer might be the first engine to be sprayed," said Percy that night in the sheds. "But I don't think he's going to be the last." The other engines looked at each other. "We should be safe for now," said Thomas, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Those vandals got Spencer when he was out in the yard, so all we've got to do is make sure we stay under a roof at night." "And that's another thing," said Emily. "Who would do such a thing as spray paint the Duke and Duchess's private engine?" "Someone with the minimum of common sense," replied Gordon bluntly. The next morning the Fat Controller called several of the engines to the shunting yards. "I'm sure you've all heard about what happened to Spencer," he began. "I'm afraid the vandals are still at large." A feeling of unease rippled among the assembled engines. "That is why," the Fat Controller went on, "I want you all to take care, especially with where you might be resting or sleeping. We've all heard horror stories about vandalism on the mainland. Well, it's up to us to make sure it's purged from Sodor." "Excuse me, sir," said Boko, "but does anyone know what these vandals look like? The ones who got Spencer, I mean." "Sadly, no. But graffiti on the mainland has often been done by young people, which might give us a clue. The important thing is that you should make sure that they don't strike again, or that if they do, it'll provide the police with more clues. Just to make sure, the workmen will be keeping a close eye on the yards around the island, and this one most particularly." After that, the engines went back to work. They were still worried about the vandals, but they knew now what they had to do in the meantime. At sunset, Thomas puffed into Knapford Yard. He had been asked to help Stafford, Stanley, Rosie and Ryan arrange the evening trains. "Hello, Thomas," called Stafford. "Glad you could join us. What's the news on those vandals?" "There is no news," said Thomas glumly. "One minute they're giving Spencer a makeover, the next they're vanished into thin air. We don't even know what they look like, let alone where to find them." "But they'll get caught, won't they?" said Rosie optimistically. "With the police on the alert, they don't stand a chance." The others cheered up at the prospect and set to work. Before too long, all the trains had been arranged and subsequently collected by their respective engines. "Oh, lads," yawned Stafford, "we'd better go and catch 40 winks. You can come and join us in the shed if you like, Thomas." "Thanks, Stafford, but I think I'll sleep out here." It only took the engines about 10 minutes to fall asleep, and silence prevailed in the yard. But not for long. There was the sound of footsteps approaching the yard, but they stopped when their owners spotted the shed. "Looks like we've hit the jackpot," said Dave, adjusting his grip on the sports bag. "4 engines right there in that shed, just waiting to be painted. We can take our pick." "Yeah, but we might wake 'em all up," said Len. "It's like I told you. We need engines that are a bit more exposed, so we can work in peace and listen out for anyone coming." Roy, who had been gazing around the yard, suddenly tapped Len on the arm and pointed to a dark shape in the shadow of a warehouse. "Take a look," he whispered. "It's the number 1 engine, right where we want him." "Well, come on. What are we waiting for?" said Len. Silently, they hurried over to the sleeping Thomas. "What'll we write on him?" asked Jill as she opened the bag and handed out the spray cans. "Whatever comes into our heads," Roy said with a shrug. "Like we do every time." The 4 teenagers began spraying Thomas. All of them tried to stick to the side of Thomas that was shrouded in darkness. Eventually, as before, they stepped back to admire their handiwork. When they'd repacked the bag, Dave picked it up and led the way towards the edge of the yard. But he wasn't looking where he was going, and as he neared the sheds where the other engines were sleeping, he tripped over a rail. The bag left his hands and tumbled to the ground, the cans rolling out with a loud clatter. "You idiot!" hissed Len. "You'll wake the whole yard!" "Sorry," said Dave as he began desperately to gather up the cans. "But it was your idea to have me carry this thing." "Fine, I'll carry it," snapped Jill, snatching the bag. "Happy?" In their haste to be on their way, none of the teenagers noticed Rosie opening her eyes. She peered blearily into the yard and saw 4 hooded figures squatting over something in the ballast. After a few minutes hissing, they stood up, one of them clutching something bulky and clanking in their arms. "Okay, let's go," said one. "Now who do you guys want to paint next time? I'd like to get Stanley." "Toby for sure," said another. "I'd like to paint James," said a third. "I'm still going for Diesel," said the one carrying the bag. They picked their way across the rails, still arguing in hushed tones, and disappeared from view. Rosie squinted at the spot where they had been before closing her eyes and going back to sleep. "Cinders and ashes!" The occupants of the shed jerked awake at the sound of Thomas's voice and saw him standing just outside the shed, looking shocked and furious. "What's all the rumpus?" asked Stanley. "What's wrong, Thomas?" "I'll tell you what's wrong," fumed Thomas. "I've been graffitied." The other engines gasped at the jumble of letters and pictures that covered Thomas's paintwork. He was almost unrecognizable. "Flippin' heck!" cried Stafford. "How could that have happened?" "Isn't it obvious? Those vandals got into the yard last night and sprayed paint all over me. I tell you, I'm going to give them what for if I find them." "Calm down, Thomas," said Ryan. "The police will sort this all out." Thomas took a deep breath and let it out as a dejected sigh. "I don't see how when we don't even know what the vandals look like." Rosie suddenly let off steam in excitement. "I think I do." Everyone stared at her. "Really?" asked Thomas eagerly. "Yes, there were 4 of them, and one of them was carrying this big bag. In fact, he dropped it and that woke me up." "What did they look like?" "That's just it. I didn't see much of them, but I think one of them was a girl by the sound of the voice. But I did hear them talking about what engine they were going to paint up next." "That might come in useful," Stanley remarked. "But for now, I think it's up to us to catch these vandals." "How?" "Simple. We'll set a trap, and if we choose a suitable engine, the vandals will fall right into it." "What sort of a trap?" asked Ryan. "We ask one of the engines to stand out in the open where the vandals can see him and get to him, preferably somewhere well lit. We'll ask a few policemen to hide nearby, and we might even join them. Then, when the vandals come out to paint the engine, bingo! We've caught them." "That's a brilliant idea!" cried Thomas, quite forgetting his condition. "Now all we have to do is find the right bait." He turned to Rosie. "Which engines did these vandals mention?" Rosie quickly rattled off the list of names she'd overheard. Thomas caught Stanley's eye, and they both grinned. "No!" No, no, and no again! Oh, come on, James. It's just one night's work. We'll make sure that vandals won't mess up your paintwork. Tank engine's honour. For the last time, Stanley, I'm not going to sacrifice my paintwork on some half-baked scheme to catch a group of artistic pea-brains. It's because of your paintwork that they'd want to spray it with graffiti. They got Spencer because he's the Duke and Duchess's engine, and Thomas because he's the #1 engine. They'll want to do you because you're the splendid red engine. Well, I suppose there's some truth in that, said James, his wrath subsiding a little. But I'm still not doing it. Stanley winked at Stafford and then sighed theatrically. All right then. We'll just ask someone else to play the hero and catch the vandals. Shame, really, but if you don't think you're up to the task... Who said I'm not up to the task? Demanded James. Let me tell you, I'm the bravest engine on this island, and just to prove it, I'll catch those vandals if it's the last thing I do. Brilliant. Now here's what we're going to do. That night, James stood in a siding in the main yard. Everything ready, Stafford? He muttered. Yup. There's half a dozen officers hiding behind trucks, and I'll be hiding in that shed over there. You know what to do, eh? Of course. Just leave it to me. That's the spirit. Out of the corner of his eye, Stafford saw one of the policemen beckoning to him. Well, I'd better get into position. Good luck. And he rolled noiselessly into the shed. James closed his eyes. I don't need luck. This'll be a doddle. Even so, he kept opening an eye to glance around the yard for a sight of the vandals. After what seemed like hours, footsteps were heard on the ballast. James quickly pretended to be asleep, even when the sounds seemed to gravitate towards him. Then he heard their voices. Well, would you look at that, muttered Roy. It's James, all alone in the yard. How come he's not in Tidmouth sheds? He probably had an argument with Gordon or someone, said Jill with a giggle. Or the others got fed up with him and gave him the boot. It took all of James's willpower not to react to this. Instead, he started snoring loudly. This gets better and better, said Len, gratified. That'll make sure no one can hear us. Come on, Dave. Let's have the heavy stuff. As a matter of fact, James's snores had been prearranged beforehand. It was a signal to Stafford and the policemen that the vandals had arrived. On cue, Stafford rolled out of his shed towards James, his progress camouflaged by trucks. Blissfully unaware of this, Dave, as before, dumped the bag on the ground and opened it. He and the others each grabbed a spray can, and then they took up their positions. Len and Roy at James's front end, Jill at his cab, and Dave at his tender. All right, guys, called Len. Same as before. He gave his can a vigorous shake, but just as he applied his finger to the nozzle, James opened his eyes and shouted a single word. No! The teenagers jumped violently and dropped their spray cans. A moment later they turned to flee, but stopped short at the blast of a horn, and Stafford's headlights flared up, dazzling them. At the same time, the policemen emerged from their hiding places and dashed towards the teenagers. Within minutes, Len, Dave, Roy, and Jill were securely handcuffed and their bag collected as evidence. I don't believe it, grumbled Len. Tricked by rusty red scrap iron. You're not required to say anything, my son, said the policeman holding him. Anything you say may be given in evidence, and that goes for the rest of you. James and Stafford smiled grimly to each other as the vandals were hustled away. Good work, you two, said a policeman. That's all right, Constable, replied Stafford. But it wasn't just us. Rosie happened to see them leaving, and Stanley came up with the plan. Well, pass on our thanks to them, would you? And don't you worry. We'll make sure those teenagers are well and truly punished. Next morning, the actions of the night before was the talk of the yard. The engines who had played a part in catching the vandals were congratulated for their efforts. Stanley, Rosie, and Stafford modestly accepted the praise, while James, of course, lapped it up for all it was worth. It wasn't until the engines learned that he had been the bait that their admiration turned to teasing, and James's pride rapidly deflated. Meanwhile, Spencer and Thomas had to go to the steamworks to have the graffiti removed from their paintwork. "Good to have you with us, my friends," said Victor as they arrived. "Now you'll both have to be repainted. But we know how much you like a fresh coat of paint, and I think it'll please you greatly to know who will be doing it." "What do you mean by that?" asked Spencer. "You'll see." Raising his voice, Victor addressed the back of the shed. "All right, you lot. Bring over some tins of blue and silver. Quickly now." "Cinders and ashes!" cried Thomas, as Jill, Roy, Dave, and Len, clad in overalls and carrying a paint tin apiece, trudged up to them. "These four will be cleaning up the mess they made as part of their punishment," explained Victor. "They'll be working here for the next week, where I and Kevin can keep an eye on them, and they won't be getting paid for it either." The teens groaned. As the former vandals began painting over their handiwork, Thomas, Spencer, Kevin, and Victor grinned at one another. "It's like you say, boss," remarked Kevin. "Crime really doesn't pay."